Before we get started with the video, just a quick pause to tell you that Wall Street Millennial now has an official Twitter account. Make sure to give us a follow by clicking the link in the description below. We'll be tweeting some really great stuff that you don't want to miss out on. And now back to the video. In 2024, Apple overtook Samsung for the first time to become the world's largest seller of smartphones. In 2024, Apple sold approximately 228 million iPhones, compared to Samsung's sales of 224 million units. This is a big accomplishment for Apple, as Samsung has been the #1 smartphone player for more than a decade. Here's a chart of iPhone versus Samsung's smartphone shipments. Apple has far more seasonality because they release all of each year's new models at the same time in the fall, while Samsung staggers its releases throughout the year. It's more comparable to look at the trailing 12-month sales. For the past decade, global iPhone shipments have remained roughly constant, at approximately 220 million units per year. Samsung, on the other hand, has seen its shipments decline steadily, from about 320 million in 2014 down to just 220 million in 2024. That's a decline of almost 1/3. Almost all of Samsung's decline can be attributed to China, which is the world's largest smartphone market. China used to be one of Samsung's biggest markets. In 2013, they sold almost 60 million phones there. But in 2015 and 2016, their sales imploded, and today they have fallen to little more than a rounding error. There are multiple reasons for Samsung's decline in China. Firstly, in early 2017, the United States deployed THAAD air defense systems in South Korea. The stated reason was to defend against potential threats from North Korea. China opposed deployment of the THAAD as it includes long-range radars, which can potentially track targets within China. The Chinese government was so mad about the THAAD that Chinese state media ran campaigns encouraging Chinese citizens to boycott South Korean brands, including Samsung. These state-run boycott campaigns were highly effective. Additionally, homegrown Chinese smartphone brands including Xiaomi, Huawei, Vivo, and Oppo started releasing high-quality smartphones which offered far better value for money. Increasing competition from Chinese brands, as well as animosity against South Korean brands, can largely explain Samsung's epic collapse in the Chinese market. Logically, these headwinds seem like they should also apply to Apple. iPhones are more expensive than most Samsung phones. If anything, you might expect them to be hit even harder by competition from Chinese brands. And if you're mad at South Korea for deploying the THAAD, you should be at least as mad at the United States, as they built the THAAD and delivered it to South Korea. In fact, the THAAD is operated by US military personnel stationed in South Korea. Despite this, there was never any boycott against Apple, which is a US company. Tens of millions of people in China are still willing to pay top dollar for iPhones, despite many domestic brands offering flagship phones at a fraction of the price. Even as Samsung's market share has collapsed to near zero, iPhone sales have remained remarkably stable. China remains a hugely important market for Apple, representing almost 20% of their global revenue. In this video, we'll examine why Apple is the only foreign smartphone brand to succeed in China, and why Samsung failed so miserably. The original iPhone was launched in 2007 and quickly became a commercial success in the United States. In 2009, they started selling iPhones in China. It quickly became a hit, as China had a large and growing middle class who could now afford to buy smartphones. In 2010, Samsung launched the Galaxy S, a family of flagship smartphones meant to compete head-on with the iPhone. Samsung already had a significant presence in China, going back to the late 1990s. They had stores selling home appliances and dumb phones, so it was relatively easy for them to start selling smartphones in China. By the early 2010s, there were already a few domestic Chinese smartphone brands, such as ZTE and Coolpad. They focused on the lower end of the market. Their phones were of lower quality and had much lower selling prices than the iPhone or Samsung Galaxy. Apple and Samsung were viewed as premium foreign brands. For the most part, people only bought domestic brands if they couldn't afford an iPhone or Galaxy. By 2013, Apple and Samsung were the two largest sellers of smartphones in China. Samsung sold 61 million phones that year, while Apple sold 36 million. This gave them approximately 18 and 11% market share of the Chinese market, respectively. From the beginning, Apple manufactured substantially all of its iPhones in China. Apple's contract manufacturer Foxconn employs hundreds of thousands of workers in China who assemble the iPhone and other Apple products. The majority of iPhones produced in China are exported all over the world. The massive demand from Apple required Foxconn to build a sophisticated supply chain to source all the component parts that go into a smartphone. Once this supply chain was established within China, it became relatively easy for homegrown Chinese companies to design and start building their own smartphones. In the early 2010s, Chinese brands including Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo came onto the scene. They started off at the low end of the market, but as they established their brand image within China, they gradually started moving up market with higher quality phones at higher price points. Starting around 2015, Samsung started losing market share to these new domestic brands. By the end of 2016, their smartphone shipments in China had already declined by approximately 70% from the peak. Early 2017 is when the THAAD controversy happened, resulting in widespread boycotts of South Korean brands in China. This dealt a crushing blow to Samsung, from which they have never recovered. This of course begs the question, why was there no boycott against Apple? The boycotts did not happen organically. They were orchestrated by Chinese state-run media. The Chinese government calculated that a boycott of Samsung would put pressure on South Korea without causing significant harm to the Chinese economy. Samsung indeed had factories in China that employed tens of thousands of workers, but these factories only assembled phones that were sold within China. They did not export any phones out of China, at least not in any great quantity. Samsung follows a distributed manufacturing approach. They have factories all over the world. Their main manufacturing hub is in Vietnam. Most of the smartphones they sell in the United States and Europe are made in Vietnam. They chose Vietnam over China due to cheaper labor costs and generous tax breaks from the Vietnam government. They also have factories in India which serve the Indian market, factories in Brazil that serve the South American market, etc. Localizing production allows Samsung to benefit from various subsidies and other government incentives in the countries where they have a manufacturing footprint. If Samsung's sales in China collapse, they'll shut down their factories in China and lay off their workers. Indeed, Samsung ceased all smartphone manufacturing in China in 2019. But by this point, Chinese brands were already in the ascendant. Anyone who participates in the Samsung boycott is likely to be patriotic-minded. Instead of purchasing a Samsung phone, they will purchase a phone made by a Chinese brand. Any decline in Samsung sales will be replaced one for one by Chinese brands. The Chinese brands all make their phones in China. The workers who were laid off from Samsung's factories can find employment at Xiaomi or Huawei factories, etc. So there is no net change in employment. Boycotting Samsung was a no-brainer. China retaliated against its geopolitical rival and showcased its resolve without incurring any economic consequences. Apple is a different story. Apple is far more important to China's economy than Samsung ever was. It is estimated that Apple indirectly supports 4.8 million jobs in China. This includes people who work for Foxconn and its various suppliers. Even at its peak in 2014, Samsung only employed around 60,000 workers in China. This is just people who worked in Samsung's factories. It doesn't include Samsung suppliers or contractors. So it's not directly comparable with the 4.8 million number for Apple. Regardless, there's no debate that Apple indirectly employs far more people in China than Samsung ever did. This was true even back in 2013 when Samsung was selling more phones in China than Apple. The vast majority of iPhones Apple sells worldwide are produced in China, but only about 20% are sold in China. The remaining 80% are exported around the world. If China were to instigate a boycott against Apple and crush its market share, Apple may decide to move its manufacturing elsewhere. 20% of Apple's production capacity could be replaced by Chinese brands. But the 80% export volume would disappear for good, resulting in millions of net job losses. We can see a symbiotic relationship between China and Apple. Apple makes billions of dollars of profits selling its phones in China. China gets millions of jobs, plus an electronics manufacturing ecosystem which also benefits domestic smartphone brands. This arrangement is far too lucrative to be derailed by something as trivial as the THAAD. This chart shows the annualized shipments of smartphone brands within China. The only foreign brands are Apple and Samsung. Xiaomi, Huawei, Oppo, and Vivo are all Chinese brands. As we discussed earlier, Samsung's market share collapsed in the mid-2010s. Samsung's market share was replaced by the Chinese brands. The largest of the Chinese brands was Huawei. They became the largest smartphone brand in China, with their shipments peaking at 140 million in 2019. During this period, Apple did lose some market share. From the peak in 2014 to the trough in 2019, iPhone shipments in China fell by almost 50%. Huawei became popular due to their premium flagship phones, which in some ways were superior to iPhones. For example, in 2019 they launched the Mate 30, which boasted a high-resolution OLED display, wireless charging, and the latest and greatest chipset with an integrated 5G modem. In 2019 and 2020, the Trump administration placed a number of technology export restrictions against Huawei. They accused Huawei of being connected to the Chinese military. In addition to making smartphones, Huawei also makes telecommunications equipment, the type of stuff that goes in cell towers. This is the area the US was mostly concerned with. They feared that Huawei's telecom equipment could be used for intelligence gathering or other military purposes, but the export restrictions applied to the entire company, including the smartphone segment. Huawei's chips were previously manufactured by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. TSMC uses US-made equipment in its fabs. To comply with Trump's export controls, TSMC was forced to stop supplying chips to Huawei. This was a disaster for Huawei, as you can't sell a phone without a chip. Huawei's shipments declined by 85% over the next year. The only reason it didn't decline to zero is because they had stockpiled a large number of chips before the ban took effect. But these would quickly run out. The export controls were specific to Huawei. The other Chinese brands continued to buy chips made by TSMC. As Huawei's shipments collapsed, this benefited Apple, Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo, who all saw their shipments surge in 2021. By this point, Samsung had already faded into irrelevance, so did not see any benefit. Huawei had a sub-brand called Honor. In late 2020, they spun off Honor as an independent company. Because Honor is no longer owned by Huawei, it is not subject to US export restrictions and can continue buying TSMC chips. We can see a massive surge in Honor's sales, filling the gap left by its former parent company. Unable to buy chips from TSMC, Huawei had to turn to China's state-owned chipmaker SMIC. SMIC is far behind TSMC in terms of technology, but they have made major advancements in recent years and are now able to manufacture chips that are good enough to put in a smartphone. In 2023, Huawei released the Mate 60, its first smartphone using a Chinese-made chipset. With Huawei now able to produce phones again, their market share has gradually increased, although they are still nowhere near their peak. Even after Huawei's return, Apple has maintained its market share, selling about 45 million iPhones per year in China. Here I have the prices of all the flagship phones available in China today. The iPhone 16 starts at the equivalent of $823 US, about the same as it costs in the US. The Samsung Galaxy S24 is exactly the same price as the iPhone. The Huawei Mate 70 is the most expensive of the Chinese flagships at $730. Huawei also has a folding phone which is more expensive, but folding phones are in their own category, so we won't consider them. The Xiaomi 14 costs $600, the Oppo Find X7 costs $550, and the Vivo X100 costs $400. Remember that we're just looking at the flagships of each brand. Most of them also have lower tier models which are much cheaper. All of the Chinese flagships are cheaper, and in some cases significantly cheaper than Apple or Samsung. So why are so many Chinese consumers still willing to pay a large premium for an iPhone, and not for a Samsung? There's a very interesting explanation for this that is unique to China. Excluding Apple, most phones around the world run the Android operating system, which is owned by Google. Android phones typically have many Google-owned apps pre-installed. For example, the Google Search widget, Gmail, and most importantly the Google Play Store. The Chinese government heavily regulates the internet. Almost all major Western internet platforms are banned in China, including Google. This creates a bit of a complication for Chinese smartphone brands. While most of them use the Android operating system, they're not allowed to preload Google-owned apps. Take the example of Xiaomi, a Chinese company that sells its smartphones both inside and outside of China. If you buy one of their phones outside of China, it looks like any other Android phone, with a Google Search widget, Google Play Store, etc. If you buy a Xiaomi phone inside China, it looks completely different. They still use an open source version of Android, but no Google apps are pre-installed. Instead, Xiaomi makes its own proprietary app store and other utility apps. This is one of the reasons that Samsung failed in China. Historically, Samsung focused most of its R&D efforts on hardware. They didn't pay too much attention to software because they just loaded the default Google apps. In China, they had to make their own app store and other utility apps. This was not something they had a lot of expertise in. By most accounts, their apps weren't very good. The Chinese brands made a much greater effort to develop their own proprietary apps, as the vast majority of their sales were in the domestic market. That's one of the major reasons why the Chinese brands were able to take so much market share from Samsung. Apple is different. From the beginning, Apple agreed to comply with all of China's internet censorship rules. They are thus allowed to offer the Apple App Store as well as their other proprietary apps in China. Of course, the Apple App Store is very different in China, as many of the apps are banned. Apple invests hugely in its software and proprietary apps, much more so than Samsung. They can all be used in China with minimal modifications. iPhone users in China get a user experience virtually identical to iPhone users anywhere else in the world, while Samsung users in China have a worse experience because they have to deal with Samsung's subpar apps. The iPhone provides a premium experience that is qualitatively different from anything the homegrown brands can offer. That's how Apple has been able to command a significant price premium, even in the fiercely competitive Chinese smartphone market. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about Apple and Samsung? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.